Okay, in this video we're going to go over Chapter 5, Elasticity and its applications. So let's say something causes the price to change, like a tax or a tariff added to it. What impact does that have? What is the magnitude of the change it has? So we quantify the change in quantity response using the term elasticity. So that is the measure of the responsiveness of quantity demanded or supplied to a change in one of its determinants. There are different types of elasticity. First, we're going to talk about price elasticity of demand, which is the measure of how much the quantity demanded responds to a change in the price. We compute this using the percentage change in the quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. So, what contributes to the magnitude of the response? Things like, what is the availability of substitutes? Like, is Pepsi a good substitute, or RC Cola a good substitute for Dr. Pepper? Is the item a necessity, or is it a luxury or a nice to have? It can also be influenced by how we define the market for that good. Is it more narrowly defined or part of a broadly defined market? So broad or large categories encompass enough that it's difficult to find a substitute for the entire category, like food. This makes the elasticity lower, and thus the magnitude of the change is going to be lower. You're not going to respond with as much change. But more narrowly defined markets have more elastic demand because it is easier to find a suitable substitute for a more narrowly defined good. That results in a greater response or greater changes to consumption for even a small change in price. So we calculate price elasticity, like I said, the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price. So if you're given these percentage changes, it's pretty easy. Now you'll see in the book it comments that while we assume for normal goods price elasticity is negative, but the book drops the sign and doesn't use absolute value bars. Both those facts bother me. So I'm typically going to keep the sign to show that we acknowledge whether the quantity increases or decreases, because that plays into what type of good it is. So I'd like you to keep the sign as well. If you're not given the percentage change, you're going to have to calculate it yourself. Now, your intuition is going to tell you to calculate the percentage change by taking the new value minus the old value and dividing it by the old value. But since you're going to be comparing values that are going to have different base to divide by, that's going to give you some unintuitive results. So we're going to be using the midpoint method to calculate the elasticities. So to do that, you take that change, the new quantity minus the old quantity, and divide that by the sum of those two values divided by 2 to give you the midpoint. And you're going to do that for both the numerator quantities and then the denominator prices. And that midpoint method will allow you to give receive a more intuitive price elasticity of demand. So the result you get can be less than 1, exactly 1, greater than 1. So elasticity is greater than 1, it's going to be elastic. So the quantity change moves proportionally more than the change in price. Elasticity less than 1 is sort of the opposite. Q is going to change less proportionally than P does. If the value is 1, that's unit elasticity, so it's a constant change in both. Now, if a good is perfectly inelastic, then that means the demand curve is going to be vertical. That's straight up and down, like this line right here. And then if it's perfectly elastic, it's going to be a horizontal line, and that approaches infinite changes. Perfectly inelastic, we'll see the changes later. So you can get a good idea of the goods price elasticity by looking at the demand curve and seeing how steep it is. So you can see here, this is that vertical demand curve for perfectly inelastic goods. So for any change in price, it remains unchanged. You know, maybe if you think chemotherapy, you're going to need that. So even if you charge more, you still need it. For inelastic demand, so that value of elasticity is less than 1. It's going to be curved like this. Unit elasticity has a constant proportional change in both Q and P. So 22% change there corresponds with a 22% change here. Elastic, so value is greater than 1. It's going to be a flatter curve right here. So you see there's more of a change for even a small change in P. There's more of a change in Q, so it's more elastic. And then perfectly elastic, there's infinite change. So anything above 0, $4, you're not going to want anything. But below $4, demand is infinite. You'll take as much as you can get. So we take these curves and we can see, based off of the equilibrium quantity at that equilibrium price, what is the total value generated. That's cool, but how do we use that for roles we may have? Well, if you're setting a price or say it's a different market, let's ignore being a price taker for a moment. Setting a price, if you change your price, how will that change your total revenue? Well, that depends on the elasticity of that good. So if it's more elastic and you increase the price, your total revenue is going to drop. But if it's less elastic, your total revenue could increase. So here we go. What I just said, if it's more inelastic, and an increase in price can yield total revenue increasing. So basically that means it covers more area and more elastic curves. It's going to end up covering less area, so less total revenue. So inelastic price elasticity of demand, or inelastic PUD, less than 1, price and total revenue move in the same direction. Elastic price elasticity of demand, or PUD, greater than 1, means price and total revenue move in opposite directions. Then unit elasticity, total revenue is going to remain constant. So even with a linear demand curve, so it's got constant slope right here, even though the slope of the demand curve is constant, the elasticity is not. Because while slope is the ratio of changes in two variables, its elasticity is the percentage change in two variables. So at points with a low price and a high quantity, so down toward this end of the curve, the demand curve is inelastic. So that's elasticity less than 1. But at points higher on the curve with higher prices and lower quantity, demand is more elastic, so it's going to be greater than 1. That's because at higher quantities, because lower price, larger changes in price are going to generate only modest changes relative to how much quantity they are at that point, and the opposite's true at the left end. So income elasticity of demand is another type of elasticity. So this is very similar. Instead of changes in price, however, we're looking at changes in income. So if you suddenly make more, even if the price of the good has stayed the same, how is your demand going to change? So normal goods have positive income elasticities because as you make more, you're going to want more of them. The opposite is true for inferior goods. The magnitude of the income elasticity can vary greatly. Necessities have smaller inelasticities, as I mentioned before. Ingalls law states that as a family's income rises, the percentage of its income spent on food declines, indicating that it has an elasticity of less than 1, because you're going to have more excess money to spend on items you couldn't buy before. So now we're going to talk about the cross-price elasticity of demand. So that's how does the quantity demanded of good 1 respond to a change in price of another good. So that's going to be cross-price elasticity of demand is equal to the percentage change in quantity demanded of good 1 divided by the percentage change in price of good 2. So positive values indicate that they are substitutes. So if the price of, Diet Coke goes up, then maybe the quantity demanded of Dr. Pepper goes up because they're substitutes. If it is negative, then that indicates they are complements. So when the price of one goes up, the quantity demanded of the other one goes down because you may buy them together. If you buy less of one, you're going to buy less of the other. So let's pause the video, take a moment, see if you can figure out the answers, and then we'll discuss. Okay, a good tends to have a small price elasticity of demand if A, the good is a necessity because the quantity demanded won't change much. For 2, an increase in a good's price reduces the total amount consumers spend on the good if the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1. That's because the proportional change in Q will be greater than P, so total revenue goes down. So a linear downward sloping demand curve is D, inelastic at some points and elastic at others, because while slope is constant, elasticity is not. And then 4, the citizens of Lilliput spend a higher fraction of their income on food than do the citizens of this other city. The reason could be that Lilliput has a lower income and the income elasticity of demand is only 0.5. So now we're going to 5.2, where we're looking at the elasticity of supply rather than demand. So discussion around tariffs and how elasticity determines much of this government's import tax impacts, and how it impacts the consumer surplus versus the producers, and what that does to quantity. We get into that later. But for now, we're going to talk about the elasticity of supply, how it's the measure of how much the quantity supplied of the good responds to change. We compute that as we did the other, but this is focused on supply. Supply elasticity in the short run is lower because things can't change that quickly. It's harder to shut down or spin up a factory in the short run, but in the long run, it is more elastic. So again here, price elasticity of supply, percentage change in quantity supplied over the percentage change in price. Like with demand, there are different potential slopes for those curves. And then think about, is it that the lower the supply, the more elastic it is, but for higher supplies, it is more inelastic? So I want you to think about that. Again, these are similar to what you saw before. Perfectly inelastic is vertical compared to perfectly elastic, which is horizontal. Inelastic supply is a steeper slope. Unit elastic is a constant slope. And there's elasticity. And elastic is a flatter supply curve. So I mentioned that before. Let's take a look at the quiz. So for 5, after you paused it and thought about it yourself, the price of a good rises from 16 to 24, and the quantity supplied rises from 90 to 110. Calculate, using the midpoint method, the price elasticity of supply. So after you've done that, you'll get 1/2. So B, if you didn't get that, I would recommend checking that even though the problem starts off with price and then says the quantity is in the numerator. That has to go up top. So you're going to want to make sure you put those in the same order they are in the formula. So if you got it wrong, check that out because it's going to end up being about 20 over 100 divided by 24 minus 16 over 20, which goes into 0.2 divided by 0.4, or 1/2. For question 6, if the price elasticity of supply is 0, then the supply curve is vertical. Because quantity supplied will not change no matter what the change in price is. For 7, the ability of firms to enter and exit a market over time means that in the long run, supply curve is elastic. So there are greater changes in quantity than price. Okay. So there are applications that I discussed earlier on how you can use your new knowledge of supply, demand, and elasticity. So what happens to total revenue when the supply increases but demand doesn't? In this example right here, see supply shifted from S1 to S2, but there's no change in the demand curve. So we have a new equilibrium of a higher quantity, but at a lower price. Consumers like that, producers maybe not so much, depends on what happens with their total revenue. In this case, it fell. I'm going to just go back to saying you'd be able to tell by doing this calculation to calculate the total area of the rectangle here and comparing. It fell from 300 to 220. As I mentioned earlier, food is a broad category and is inelastic, so a decrease in price causes total revenue to fall for suppliers. This chapter talks about the impact to farmers and how when everyone adopts it, they all end up worse off, but they all adopt the new technology anyway. So think about, and I'm not going to tell you what you should think here, I just want you to think about, is there a role for the government to play in this? What would be the consequences of them playing a role? What would be the positive ones? What would be the negative ones? What would be the direct? What would be the indirect effects of a potential policy from them? And then think about, challenge yourself. Say, this is what I think. And then say, well, how could this be, how could I think about this differently? Think about other industries, coal industries and whatnot, or the semiconductor industries. Are there industries that should be propped up at taxpayer expense? This talks about how coordinating collusion in supply doesn't always work, and everyone can end up being worse off from a supplier standpoint. And this shows how we can show supply graphs in multiple time frames. As we said, supply doesn't change that easily or that quickly or that cheaply, so you have to look at the immediate term and the long run. So policies can have indirect effects beyond the direct effects they were aimed at, as I brought up. This brings up when you're trying to combat drugs and the negative impacts on society, you can have a well-intended policy that can have negative direct indirect effects that actually make the problem worse. So that's why policy making is hard. That's why policy economists should be involved in that process so they can help think through these things. It's why it's so important to have good data on how people react in reality to policy changes. I'm going to have you pause this and try to answer the questions on your own, and then I will discuss. Okay, for question 8, an increase in the supply of grain will reduce the total revenue grain producers receive if C, the demand curve is inelastic. And for food stuff, that's typically the case. Remember that increasing the supply when there's inelastic demand will lower the cost will lower the price while increasing the supply, but in the end TR goes down for the suppliers. For question 9, in competitive markets, Farmers adopt new technologies that will eventually reduce their revenue because each farmer is a price taker. A. Question 10. Because the demand for oil is more elastic in the long run, so I think, again, that's the long run, so you've got greater time to make changes. OPEC's reduction in the supply of oil had a smaller impact on the price in the long run than it did the short run. The short run, you can't make changes as quickly. For question 11, over time, technological advances increase consumers' incomes and reduce the price of smartphones. Each of these forces increases the amount consumers spend on smartphones. If the income elasticity of demand is greater than 0, and the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1. So you might have to think about that a little bit more. For spending on normal goods to rise when income rises, income elasticity of demand must be proportionally greater than the change in price, greater than 0. And for when prices fall, price elasticity must be greater than 1. So the change in quantity is proportionally greater than the change in price. Got a little chart here. I want to take another swing at this, make sure it displays well, but I tossed that in there for additional perspective. And I want you to go through these questions, think through them. You can comment with your thoughts. Let me know if you have any questions about discussing them. These are the main concepts you need to make sure that you have a good grasp of. And then I just want you to review these and make sure you've got a good grasp of them, because they're really important to what happens in this chapter. All right. Thanks, everyone, and I hope you got something good out of that.